It's sad but true. Sometimes even games with great potential never make it out of development. Here are the 13 biggest games that never came out.
Fable Legends was a 4v1 multiplayer game that had 4 people who were basically like heroes from the classic Fable franchise, and then 1 player who could kind of like place traps and control enemies.
There was really not much of a story to it, but it was multiplayer centric.
Didn't really have that much to do with Fable, aside from being able to fight.
The charm, the world, the humor, all of that was gone in favor of this service-based, infinitely replayable multiplayer instance game.
It sucks that Lionhead shut down because it would have been so much better if they had made Fable 4 instead, and I still hope that happens.
So Project LMNO has an amazing history behind it. So visionary director, lauded man, Steven Spielberg wanted to make video games.
LMNO was a much more mature, story-driven adventure game that evolved your relationship with this alien who would come down to Earth and you trying to protect her, a little bit like E.T.
Part of it was parkour, adventure.
He was trying to create this huge link between the player and the characters in the game.
Went through so many changes and so many phases until EA quietly canceled it in 2010. So I guess rather than sink more resources into this thing, they just decided we're going to have to cut our losses on it.
The Prey 2 was going to be kind of a loose sequel to the original, where you were going to play as an air marshal on a plane that got sucked into the same alien world. So you're kind of Boba Fett-ish, running around an open world doing parkour, chasing after criminals. Except it didn't really look like the same alien world. It now looks like very Star Wars Cantina-ish.
If nothing else, it's kind of weird that we got something so seemingly close to completion shown off at E3 and then just sort of disappeared for a while.
Like it looked really cool. It looked like something I wanted to play.
BC was a really interesting game from Peter Molyneux. It was set in the Stone Age, or the Dinosaur Age at least. You played a caveman, but you were one of a tribe. It was this whole living ecosystem, which back then, 2003 was pretty out there. And I just remember being super impressed by it. I was blown away. BC really just showed so much potential. I'm sad we never got to play it.
Yeah, so Silent Hills might be one of the most heartbreaking games on this list. It stemmed from the relationship between Guillermo del Toro and Hideo Kojima, and obviously when that first playable teaser was released at Gamescom, no one knew what this was, and then you got to the end of this gorgeous, terrifying horror experience, and if you got the true ending, you realized, holy crap, this is a lead-in to Silent Hills, a reboot of the series from those 2 creators and The Walking Dead's Norman Reedus.
Kojima and del Toro were going to work together on making Silent Hills, and in my head, that is a perfect scary game or a perfect survival horror.
They were really trying to push the boundaries of horror and do things with technology in your house and the way the game would interact with lights in your house, objects in your house, Wi-Fi, in a way that seemed really crazy and honestly just completely different than anything that's ever been done before.
I still really hope that del Toro and Kojima make something that's like what Silent Hills might have been, but it wasn't going to work with Konami.
Star Wars 1313 was this sort of cover shooter action platformer game that took a different track than most other Star Wars games.
That was basically sort of like Uncharted meets Assassin's Creed meets Star Wars.
This was a game about a bounty hunter.
Everything we saw alluded that this game was going to be awesome and original, and it was basically going into the depths of Coruscant.
Not a Force game at all. It was about gadgets and criminals and puzzles and cool platforming.
It was sort of on the heels of a lot of LucasArts games kind of coming to an end, the entire studio closing down as well.
I mean, ultimately Star Wars 1313 was a victim of the Disney buyout of LucasArts.
Kind of all the best things in the world coming together at once, and then not coming together at all.
Thrill Kill was to be a 4-player fighting game for the PlayStation 1. It was very hyper-violent and crudely sexual, especially for the time. I actually bought a bootleg copy of Thrill Kill off eBay, and I modded my PlayStation to be able to play it. I mean, it's not a great fighting game. It's not compared to a Street Fighter or even a Mortal Kombat. It was a game that was trying to survive completely on its premise and its over-the-top violence and sexual innuendo. And the game was finished. It was supposed to be out in weeks, but EA decided not to publish it because of, they called it, I think, senselessly violent. The irony being, of course, that by today's standards, it's pretty tame. But fun fact, even though Thrill Kill was canceled, they repurposed the 4-player fighting engine into Wu-Tang Shaolin style.
So StarCraft Ghost was even more fascinating than the usual Blizzard game because at that point in time, Blizzard wasn't making console games, and it was going to be a stealth game. Stealth was huge at the time with Metal Gear Solid and Splinter Cell, and so Blizzard making a stealth game was just like the stuff of dreams at that point. It had the typical Blizzard polish on it, as of course a lot of E3 demos do, but it just, yeah, it is a shame that one never made it to the finish line.
Star Fox 2 is actually one of the more complete games on this list.
So Star Fox 2 was supposed to be the sequel to Star Fox, which was a big success for Nintendo for a couple reasons. One is because it had the power of basically polygons on a 16-bit console, which was unheard of at the time.
It was supposed to be originally for the Super Nintendo and was canceled, and most of the ideas in it went into Star Fox 64, which is where most people played Star Fox for the first time.
So Star Fox 2 was canceled basically because Nintendo looked at, okay, we're making a sequel to Star Fox, but we have a 3D console, a console that can handle 3D graphics in the Nintendo 64.
It was in that kind of bridge period between the Super Nintendo and the N64, where a lot of games kind of fell between the cracks, and I think, like most prototype games, the ideas in it moved on to the next console, so there was never really any true reason to put it back out there.
And so it was this weird thing where a Miyamoto game got canceled, and that's something that, at least for a publicly announced sequel that was covered all over the place in magazines, that had never happened before.
Mega Man Universe was going to be a new Mega Man game, a 2.5D side-scroller, and it was going to incorporate things like user-generated levels and a lot of community stuff, as well as Capcom IPs like Ghost and Goblins for neat flavor. It was a really interesting project that unfortunately never completely came together. You never got a lot of sense of unity to the project, and I don't think that was any indicator that it was a mess. Rather, I think that they were simply not past the concept stage yet, and that they were still filtering out the good ideas from the bad. And unfortunately, it never lasted long enough for them to get past that. You know, the Blue Bomber ain't what he used to be in terms of millions of copies sold, and it may just be that Capcom thought they could make more money someplace else.
6 Days in Fallujah was going to be a very tactical, realistic, third-person squad game set in the actual Iraq war that was still very much on everybody's minds. There were some names and some pedigree behind it, and then literally like a very, very short time later, there was a backlash. It was just not well received by the general public. The Iraq war was, of course, extremely controversial, still is, and Konami just dropped the game and nobody ever picked it up and it never came out. Rainbow Six Patriots was going to be the long-awaited return of Rainbow Six because it had just laid dormant for way too long.
So when we first saw Rainbow Six Patriots, Ubisoft showcased this really emotional demo where we had this husband and wife in their living room and they were celebrating a birthday together. And this was sort of the story that they were going for, this really grounded approach to storytelling.
It had a very, very cinematic feel to it, but like a number of Tom Clancy games before it, ended up getting totally scrapped before we ended up getting Rainbow Six Siege years later.
I felt like it was a really interesting and mature take on the story, and this was this era where Ubisoft was evolving as a developer and as a publisher.
They're not afraid to cancel a game 2 or more years into development and say, well, that didn't quite work out, let's start over.
If I had to guess, I'd say the reason that Rainbow Six Patriots was canceled and eventually became Rainbow Six Siege is that it was dealing with these really tricky, mature topics like terrorism and like security and the Patriot Act. And that's just something that is really tough to manage, so I could sort of understand why it eventually became Siege. So Legacy of Kain Dead Son was the reported 6th game in the Legacy of Kain series that sort of was doomed for failure. We saw a lot of different incarnations of it throughout pretty much the entirety of the 2000s. So in 2015, we got this huge dump, almost a half an hour of footage from what was Legacy of Kain Dead Son, and it was amazing to see how far along this game was. Mechanically, it had learned a lot from previous games of the past 10 years, stuff like Assassin's Creed, stuff like Batman, the Arkham series, had a very fluid combat system where you're dealing with multiple guys at once. These really robust climbing mechanics. The way the world was presented, it would tear apart and reform itself, sort of a dimensional shift. The single player portion is something that just seems lost to time, but it's interesting because it had a multiplayer portion called Nosgoth, where half the players play as humans and half of them are playing as vampires, and it's sort of this asymmetrical multiplayer that I find really fascinating. So that's the one way we can sort of have a glimpse of still what the Legacy of Kain game would have been.